In 1971, 8 lesbian women came together on a weekly basis to discuss the emancipation of lesbians. They had gotten sick of the male domination of gay rights advocacy. Most gay rights advocacy groups were dominated by a male norm and lacked any kind of feminist perspective. At the same time, second-wave feminism, which had at that point become in full swing, lacked any attention to sexual diversity. So, in September 1972, 3 of the women of Purple Mine decided to form a more radical lesbian action group called Paarse September. This group was purposefully provocative, and they challenged heterosexual feminism with their now infamous statement: homosexuality is not primarily to do with sex. Homosexuality is a political choice that women make if they are serious about their feminism. Their strategy was polarizing, and after only a year and a half, the group disbanded, saying that their polarizing strategy had lost its productive power and that it was now up to new lesbian feminist initiatives. Paarse September was very influential for the lesbian feminist movement in the Netherlands and the women's movement as a whole. But their story has come to dominate the history that has been written and told about the lesbian feminist movement. The story of radical lesbian feminists who cut all ties with male homosexuals and heterosexual feminists because they were discriminated against by both is a well-known one, not just in the Netherlands, but also in the US, the UK, France, and Germany. But this narrative privileges the most radical lesbian feminists, depicted since their emergence as strict separatists and man-haters. This is a narrow view of the lesbian feminist movement, which has been perpetuated by a focus on only the most radical feminists and their theoretical musings. In his seminal work, Finding the Movement, Finn Enke argues that by looking at the feminist movement from a spatial perspective, we might see lesbian feminists who define themselves less starkly in opposition to the heterosexual feminist movement or the male-dominated gay emancipation movement. In this video essay, I would like to take a closer look at specific cases of lesbian feminists and the spaces they claimed, both by taking to the streets and creating their own social spaces. By looking at lesbian feminist spaces and practices, we may be able to see how they defined themselves in other ways and how they embodied real solidarity with both heterosexual feminists and gay men, and other marginalized groups as well. Moreover, we may find that lesbian feminist movements were outside of Amsterdam, which has dominated Dutch LGBTQ+ history. In their article about Lesbian Nation, which was a Dutch lesbian feminist group named after the book by Jill Johnston, Noah Little argues that this group did have separatist tendencies, but that it also showed tendencies more in line with what's called cultural feminism, a strand of feminism which focused on the revaluing of women in a cultural sense and creating a women's culture. These two strands of feminism, lesbian separatist feminism and cultural feminism, are often seen as opposing each other, but Little shows in their article that the practice of Lesbian Nation were compatible with both strands of feminism. They imagined a separatist lesbian utopia, which was both separatist and created a different women's culture. They also showed real solidarity with both gay men and heterosexual women. For example, they were some of the first people who protested for abortion rights. They organized the first large-scale gay protest in the Netherlands. And they were, for example, also active in anti-nuclear weapons demonstrations. During the 1970s and the 1980s, lesbian women established public spaces and organized protests and gatherings all over the country. These spaces and gatherings were often only open to women, but not always. And many lesbian feminists took part in activism that was concerned with other social issues. The ways in which they related to these social movements was not as straightforward as being either separatist or in solidarity with them. And when we look at specific cases and places, we see that the story is often a lot more nuanced than that. In Lavender and Red, Liberation and Solidarity in the Gay and Lesbian Left, Emily Hobson counters the idea that the gay and lesbian movement was a single-issue, racially limited movement. There's a prevailing idea that the gay and lesbian rights movements were solely focused on gay rights and that this movement was overwhelmingly white. Hobson revises the standard history of gay and lesbian activism. For example, one reviewer stated that, for too long, gay and lesbian activism in the 70s and 80s has been remembered as single issue and racially whitewashed. Lavender and red is the antidote we've been waiting for. I would also argue that this prevailing idea that lesbian and gay movements were limited in their diversity actually continues to render diverse individuals within the movements invisible. Hobson's book is about the gay and lesbian left, which lasted from the 1960s until deep into the AIDS crisis. She argues that rather than aiming for an alliance with several political causes, they saw solidarity as an integral part of their struggle, and saw various leftist political causes as interwoven and integrated. Gay and lesbian activists not only allied themselves with other social and political organizations, but saw heterosexism as interwoven and interconnected with racism, capitalism, and war. For them, sexual liberation and radical solidarity were interdependent, or even one and the same. Their gay and lesbian identities were not just sexual desires, but political affiliations. And the conditions for sexual liberation was liberation from all systems of oppression and power. The assimilation of gay people into straight frameworks is often seen as the end goal of homosexual emancipation movements. For example, the legalization of gay marriage. It's the idea that gay people can be just like straight people and fit into normative ideals of heterosexism and capitalism. But for people of the gay and lesbian left, these ideals perpetuated systems of oppression. The movement drew upon anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism, and anti-imperialism in order to pursue their sexual politics. I argue that these ideas can be found in lesbian feminism as well. The most obvious example of this is how they saw sexism and homophobia as interrelated and mutually constructed. In 1980, Adrienne Rich published an essay called Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. In it, she argued that heterosexuality was not an innate feeling of desire, but was rather an institution imposed on women by patriarchal societies. She argued that women were conditioned by patriarchal societies to be heterosexual, and that this in turn forced them into subordinate position of submitting to their husband. Being a lesbian was political, because it was a way for women to take back their power from men. Lesbian existence proved that women could have a sexuality completely separate from men. And by this logic, lesbianism was a political choice because it meant choosing not to abide by the heterosexist rules of patriarchy. Lesbian feminists who were inspired by Rich's essay saw feminism and the emancipation of lesbians not just as two related movements, but as deeply interrelated. The oppression of women and the oppression of homosexuals worked to constitute and enforce each other. In 1973, Jill Johnston published Lesbian Nation, The Feminist Solution. Johnston argued that the problems of heteropatriarchy were only solvable through lesbian separatism. In order to liberate themselves from male oppression, women would need to live in isolation from men in a separate lesbian utopia. In Johnston's view, heterosexuality was a form of collaboration with patriarchal power. Lesbian separatism, as a broader movement, argued that lesbians needed their own movement separate from straight feminists because they were made invisible in the movement at large. In fact, lesbians were often encouraged to hide their sexuality as not to scare off straight feminists. One of the women of Past September went so far as to say that radical feminism was not radical at all because of the suppression of lesbian voices and issues. She stated that the movement is a heterosexual movement in which lesbians are tolerated, in which heterosexual problems, marriage, heterosexual relationships, and the hassle surrounding them, straight sex, motherhood, and so on, are prioritized, and lesbians may then discuss these problems. They should not, of course, go to the heart of the matter by asking how radical feminism and heterosexuality can be reconciled at all. Radical feminism is anything but radical, which is why I left it. Because, as the Black Panther said, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, baby. The creation of separate lesbian spaces in the 1970s and 80s can be seen as in line with this separatist ideology. However, it was often the case that lesbian feminists created spaces that were open to heterosexual women as well. They often gave attention to the commonalities between all women and focused their energies on creating a women's culture in which they could revalue the attributes ascribed to women in patriarchal society. The prevailing idea is that lesbian feminists were generally white, middle class, and only focused on their own issues. But when we look at their practices and the spaces they created, they also showed solidarity with other oppressed groups, and often concern themselves with many issues. So first, let's look at one of the prevalent categories of such spaces, lesbian archives. In 1981, the lesbian feminist Maaike Meijer visited the Lesbian History Archives in New York. After this, when she came back to the Netherlands, she published an article calling for the creation of lesbian archives in the Netherlands. She stated that, "You know the mores and habits of your own lesbian tribe, but you don't know how the lesbian tribes of 20, 30, 50 years ago lived. Nobody preserves lesbian culture, nobody remembers our tradition, at least not in the Netherlands." In that same year, the first Women's Summer University took place in Amsterdam, which was a week filled with discussions and seminars about feminist activism and the sciences. During this week, a group of lesbian women came together to discuss the possibility of setting up a lesbian archive in the Netherlands. That September, one of these women published an advertisement in the Journal for Gay and Lesbian Studies to ask for suggestions and ideas about setting up such an archive. In early 1982, around 70 women came together to discuss setting up an archive, whether these should be multiple archives in regional locations or one centralized archive in Amsterdam, and what the collection policy would be like. This led to the creation of 5 regional lesbian archives in the Netherlands, which would work together under the LOLA, their collective name, to discuss collection policies and publicity, for example. One of these archives would be in Amsterdam. The Lesbian Archive in Amsterdam opened its doors in March 1983. It was originally located in the basement of a private home, and it was so small that they could barely walk between the bookcases and the table. Concerning the type of people who visited the archive, one of the employees stated that it was mostly lesbian women who used it. She said, "Heterosexual women are clearly a minority. On a rare occasion, a homosexual man visits. And the printer repairman, but he doesn't really count." According to another employee, the women of the archive would rather not have men visit. She stated that men already had enough places where they could go, and that as the Lesbian History Archive was the only place where lesbian women could research their own history, they wanted to keep it safe. In 1990, the Lesbian Archive in Amsterdam moved to a larger space. This was particularly helpful because they suffered from what they called collection fever, which meant that they collected a very large amount of any and all things concerning lesbian existence. This also had to do with the fact that they had a very broad collection policy and a broad understanding of what lesbian existence meant. To them, lesbian existence wasn't limited to women who had proven sex with other women, but also to women who lived together, women who lived outside of the norms of society and against patriarchal values, and women who were friends or female companions. The archive accepted all kinds of materials. They were even once jokingly offered one of the toilet bins from a lesbian cafe in Amsterdam, although they never received it. Their motto was, "We only collect what we enjoy," and they called themselves the Archive of Passion. This was because they didn't only collect materials concerning women who had sex with other women, but any materials to do with women who were passionate about women. By the 1990s, the Lesbian Archive in Amsterdam had specialized in collecting video materials and videotaping lesbian feminist activism themselves. This broad collection policy and understanding of lesbian existence wasn't rare in that time. The Lesbian Archive in Leeuwarden, for example, in the northeast of the country, defined lesbian existence as the breaking through in other ways of living and women's resistance against the imposed male domination. In other words, the existence of lesbians through the centuries and of women who, in one way or another, chose each other to be life partners or allies. In a newsletter of the Lesbian Archive in Nijmegen, this topic was also discussed. Could they call women who lived together in the 1920s lesbians? Could they call a woman who had an affair with a woman but was married to a man a lesbian? They wrote, "The question, what is a lesbian, or what can be called lesbian as such, is a recurring one, to which there is no simple or single answer." These questions reflect earlier ways of thinking in lesbian feminism. Lesbianism was not just seen as sexuality, but as the breaking of societal norms, especially surrounding ways of living. Lesbianism was seen as a form of political resistance. Thus, some lesbian archives went so far as to see any women resisting male power as relevant to a lesbian archive. In this sense, lesbian archives were inherently in solidarity with the heterosexual women's movement because they saw their struggles as mutually constituted. The Lesbian Archive Nijmegen opened its doors in January 1985 after a few years of preparation. The archive had been set up as a collective 3 years earlier, during a meeting of around 20 women who were interested in participating. The following years consisted of weekly meetings, a research project to collect materials of the past 10 years of lesbian history in Nijmegen, and fixing up the room where the archive would be placed. During this period, the collective shrank from 20 women to around 7 women, who worked together in a non-hierarchical fashion. In 1983, they officially became a foundation. For official purposes, they needed to have a chair, a secretary, and a treasurer, but because they wanted to work in a non-hierarchical way, they drew straws to see who would get these functions on paper. When the archive was first set up, it was placed in the bedroom of one of the women of the collective. This was not at all uncommon at the time. The archive in Utrecht was also first set up in someone's house, and, as stated before, the archive in Amsterdam was placed in the basement of a residential home as well. But because they needed more space, they tried to find someplace bigger. They were offered a space by the Homo House, or the Gay House, IHLIA, in Nijmegen. But the women of the Lesbian Archive in Nijmegen were very hesitant to take up space in such a place because they felt that it would have to mean giving up some of their autonomy. They did end up deciding that they would place their archive in IHLIA in Nijmegen, but under strict conditions. They would have no excessive advertisements for the COC. They also wanted to get a low price and no arguments about the archive only being open to women, and they wanted it to be accessible for disabled women. From these conditions, it seems that the Lesbian Archive was uninterested in collaboration and integration with the male gay movement. They actually wanted to separate themselves from it, which shows its separatist tendencies. The Lesbian Archive in Amsterdam, on the other hand, seems to have been less explicitly close to gay men. The Lesbian Archive in Leeuwarden, in the northeast of the country, was also more open to collaboration with gay organizations. For example, they exchanged information with the Homodoc, which was a mostly male gay documentation center in Amsterdam. They suggested exchanging copies of their newsletters. They helped each other find certain sources or books or people. And when the archive in Leeuwarden opened, the Homodoc in Amsterdam expressed a hope for good collaboration in the future. So the archive in Leeuwarden seems to have been more open to collaboration, although of course there is a difference between exchanging some materials and actually allowing men to enter a women's space. What the conditions of the Lesbian Archive in Nijmegen also indicate is that they were concerned with disability and accessibility for disabled people. They found it important enough that their space was accessible to name it as one of their conditions. In one of their later newsletters, the Lesbian Archive in Nijmegen also included an article by a woman who called herself a rolpot, or rolling dyke, a lesbian woman in a wheelchair. They also talked about a group of deaf and hard-hearing gay men and lesbian women. This article called for more visibility for blind and deaf people within the gay and lesbian movement. Clearly, this kind of intersectional thinking and activism was already present during the early 1980s, although this is often forgotten or not talked about. It goes against the idea that the female activism at this time wasn't inclusive. Lesbian archives were both separatist, separating themselves from especially the gay emancipation movement, but also the heterosexual female movement. But they also practiced inclusivity through their archival policies. Moreover, in practice, the lesbian archives were connected with both the gay emancipation movement and the women's movement. So although this may not have been a form of radical solidarity, they did collaborate and they were in solidarity with each other, even when they were practicing separatist policies. In 1987, Black lesbian feminist activist Nanda Rutjes was interviewed for a local newspaper in the town where she lived and practiced her activism, Doetinchem. As opposed to larger cities such as Amsterdam or Utrecht, which had lesbian communities, or Nijmegen, which was a student city with a lesbian and gay scene, Doetinchem was a small rural town in the east of the country, a part of the country known colloquially as the back corner of the country. It was here that in the 1980s, Nanda would practice her activism against all kinds of injustices that she could find within Dutch society. Rather than focusing on a single issue, such as heterosexism or racism, she focused on a host of issues which she saw as interconnected. She did this together with a group of activists who she met through the World Shop, a type of non-profit shop which focused on fair trade with the Global South. Although World Shops today are known mostly for their fair trade products. Back in the 1970s and 1980s, they were hubs of local activism. The World Shop in Doetinchem, in particular, had an anarchist strand, which somewhere in the 1980s split off to form an anti-fascist group. Starting in 1981 or 1982, this group mostly focused on exchanging ideas between themselves and between others, for example, in local community centers in working-class neighborhoods. They also acted on the edges of legality by using graffiti, civil disobedience, and using squats as exhibition spaces. And of course, they also attended demonstrations, although this was done more on an individual basis. The group concerned itself with issues ranging from anarchism and anti-capitalism to nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, racism, gay and lesbian rights, feminism, apartheid, anti-militarism, and art. Rather than viewing these as a set of separate but important issues, they saw them as interconnected. They were all seen as symptoms of the same underlying problem. And although they could not all focus on all of these issues at the same time, they wanted to make the world as a whole a better place, which meant not only fighting for equal rights, but also caring about nature. They saw these issues as connected to gender and power. Men, testosterone, and power, the proverbial capitalist pigs, were the cause of all ills in society. In an interview, Nana said about herself, "In this consumer society, I protest against the violence of the male hetero-racism culture by showing my power as a woman, by being a dyke, being jobless, and being creative." Nana politicized her lesbianism not just as a strategy against heterosexism, but against all forms of oppression and power. This worldview, which today might be called holistic, speaks to the kind of queer solidarity which Emily Hobson found in the gay and lesbian left in San Francisco, but in this case can be found in a small town in the Netherlands. Anarcho-feminists combine feminist theory with anarchist theory, generally meaning that they see struggle against the patriarchy as part of class struggle. Traditional gender roles are seen as one of the enforced hierarchies of society. Although feminist anarchists were already active in Europe during the first feminist wave, the anarcho-feminist movement as such really emerged in the 1960s in the US and the 1970s in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, during the 1960s, anarchist thinking gained popularity through the Provo movement, which was the most popular counterculture movement of the 1960s. But women in anarchist circles often felt discriminated against based on their gender, and when second wave feminism emerged, they shifted their focus to gender roles. In a 1982 interview in Diva, a lesbian magazine, lesbian anarcho-feminists Marta and Gerda looked back on the past decade and how anarcho-feminism developed in the Netherlands. For them, the anarchist movement had become isolating because they were seen as two strange lesbians. They joined one of the first feminist consciousness-raising groups. These groups were at the heart of the feminist movement in the 1970s. They consisted of women coming together to discuss social-political issues and their personal experiences of patriarchal society. The group Marta and Gerda were a part of was a mixed heterosexual and lesbian group, but a lesbian group split off from this. They were set up in an anarchic way, with no hierarchies and no need to ask permission from the others to organize any feminist activities. In 1973, they were part of the squat of the first women's house in Amsterdam. This was a radical center of feminist activism, and after the women's house in Amsterdam was squatted, many followed around the country. Arguably then, feminism and anarchism were connected from the start, with feminist activist groups being set up in deliberately anarchic ways, and with squatting, which in the Netherlands was a left-wing anarchist movement, being at the foundation of these women's hubs. For Marta and Gerda, anarchism had become part of all of their activism. So, for example, fighting for the right to abortion was a small part of a larger struggle. In 1979, a national day for anarcho-feminists was organized. This led to the creation of an anarcho-feminist zine, which was produced by a different group each time it was published. This also led to the organization of an anarcho-feminist weekend in a small town in the north of the Netherlands called Appelscha, where 400 women came together to create new activist groups. Especially visible among these was the Abominable Snow Woman, which was an anti-violence and street intimidation group. A national anti-porn demonstration also followed the weekend in Appelscha. At this point, the anarcho-feminist movement had really taken shape. Just as in the radical feminist movement, lesbians were very active in the anarcho-feminist movement. For some, their lesbianism and their anti-capitalist views were interconnected or even inseparable. In one zine, a lesbian feminist described it like this: "We are not a leftist group and additionally a lesbian group. Our lesbianism is the foundation of our leftist views, because we believe that we can never freely be lesbians in this capitalist system that is characterized by exploitation, inequality, and property, in which everyone is a victim, but sadly, women more so than men, based on marriage and the nuclear family, the ideal consumption and reproductive units." In the anarchist lesbian zine IHLIA, an interpretation of Genesis is given which sheds light on their interpretation of the connection between lesbianism and anarchism. When Adam and Eve are kicked out of paradise, God turns to Eve and gives her 4 punishments. He says, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor, you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." In the zine, this is described as the mythical justification of patriarchy, and especially of compulsory heterosexuality, hierarchy, and property, specifically the view that women are the property of their husband or father. And the only way to get back to a time before patriarchal oppression is through anarcho-lesbianism. Some anarcho-feminist collectives were not formally lesbian initiatives, but were often organized by lesbians. One clear example is anarchist feminist printing press Atalanta, which was founded in 1979 by a group of women who were unhappy with the existing media and how they portrayed radical feminism. Although Atalanta was not a lesbian printing press per se, it was an unspoken truth that it was a lesbian initiative. They called themselves a women's press most of the time, but there were also times they called themselves a dyke press. They also felt that they were most alike to the lesbian feminist movement because it was the most radical and free-spirited. The most inspiring were those lesbian feminists who were also anarchists. One of their first publications, Dyke's Stories Poems, is about the history of Rijmke and Weije's relationship and about the love between women. However, Rijmke and Weije's publications encompassed a much broader activist view, which connected all kinds of oppression. They were especially concerned with the hierarchical societal relationship between humans and other animals. They both became vegans in the early 1980s, and they wrote many stories about animals. Together with a friend, they wrote an article called "Not Drinking Milk, What Does It Have to Do with the Feminist Movement?", in which they argued that feminists were too limited in their activism. They focused on only one kind of oppression rather than all kinds of oppression, stating, "It is scarcely threatening to the patriarchy if everyone resists in only one area, without connecting it to other suffering which also needs to be put out of the world." They also criticized feminists for what they perceived as the hypocrisy of being a feminist activist while consuming as much as a capitalist. Of course, this led to many strong reactions from feminists who said that veganism had nothing to do with feminism. The women of Atalanta responded to this by publishing another article in which they reiterated that they saw all forms of oppression as interconnected, and that this total philosophy ran through their whole way of life. They were feminists, lesbian, animal-friendly, nature-friendly, anti-weapons, and anti-racism. The total philosophy of Atalanta and the anti-fascist group in Doetinchem share a striking resemblance. They both considered the oppression of homosexuality to be linked to all other forms of oppression. And rather than just being leftist and lesbian anarcho-feminists saw the two as interrelated. Of course, there were lesbian anarcho-feminists who struggled with ideas of solidarity, especially when they were enforced. For some, solidarity had become a questionable term even within the feminist movement. In an article in IHLIA from 1980, the writer argues that solidarity had come to mean denying the differences between women in order to fight patriarchy. But this meant denying important differences of opinion, even when those differences did not cease to exist. She argues that it is better for women to employ their own strategies and attack the patriarchy from all angles, rather than to give up their individuality and beliefs in order to form a united front. For that matter, she argues that unity is too quickly mistaken to mean uniformity. In arguing for the differences between women, she argues for a kind of solidarity which does not preclude lesbian separatism, but embraces it. At the same time, anarcho-feminists argued for the creation of a separate women's world, which meant creating bookshops, cafes, and living communities. An article in the anarcho-feminist zine Black Tarantula discusses the relationship between anarcho-feminism and men. According to the writers, women in the anarchist movement were expected to be in solidarity with working men even if they were harassed by them, or if they were not treated as equals in their personal relationships. For some women, the limit had been reached, leading them to sever all ties with men and become lesbians. Many of the anarcho-feminist projects which I have discussed were for similar reasons located in women's squats which were closed to men. Atalanta, for example, was located in such a women's squat in Utrecht. It was an unspoken rule that men were not allowed in the squat until around 1986, when they became more open to working with men who held similar views. The first women's house, which was squatted in 1973 in Amsterdam, is one of the first examples of a squat which housed anarcho-feminist initiatives among others, and in which men were not allowed. By the 1980s, there were many women's squats in which lesbians were well represented. Many of them were anarchists and anti-establishment. These separate women's spaces were fundamental to the anarcho-feminist movement. So while lesbian anarcho-feminists practiced separatism, they also largely demonstrated solidarity by advocating for systemic change for all oppressed groups, including sometimes animals. In the summer of 1973, a feminist squatters collective broke into an old vocational school in the heart of Amsterdam with one clear goal: to create a space that would be just for women and where men would not be allowed. The months leading up to the squat had been filled with a lot of anticipation and, true to feminist form, a lot of discussion. It had become clear that women needed a space to hold meetings, organize their activities, and perhaps create a women's culture. On the night of June 6, 1973, a group of around 10 women broke into a large building and camped there the whole night, in their sleeping bags, covered in dust, waiting for the police to come. Luckily, they didn't. The building was a palace. It was 4 stories tall and had a lot of space, but it also needed a lot of work. So, over the summer, women from all over Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and even from abroad came to the house to help out. The house became filled with women from different groups, such as the Social Pacifist Party and Dolomina, and new groups were also created in its halls. For example, a feminist film collective, a carpentry group, a gardening group, and a feminist publisher called Buiten, or Colored Laundry. Lesbian women were foundational to the women's house from the start. The Buiten group consisted of lesbian women who adopted a Marxist lens, prioritizing class struggle over their lesbian identities. On the other hand, the aforementioned lesbian feminist group Buiten September held a more radical perspective, putting their sexuality at the forefront of their politics by arguing that lesbianism was a political choice. The differences between lesbian and heterosexual feminists led to friction on more than one occasion. In 1974, this conflict came to a head when some of the people in the women's house wrote an open letter to one of the members of Buiten September, complaining that she was too dominant and made other women feel forced into silence. We have no defense against someone who just talks on about their own rightness. We are in the women's house not only to be free from men, but also to be able to talk without male discussion tactics, which most of us have simply not mastered. Because you force us to use male discussion tactics too, or resort to silence, shouting, or running away. If anyone opposes your unsolidarity, you invoke solidarity. You acquire an oppressor's position by constantly posing as the most oppressed. In answer to the letter, a group of lesbian feminists in the women's house responded, mainly arguing against how the inciting letter had been spread across the women's house. The letter was a personal attack, spread in the house without any warning. So, although lesbian and heterosexual feminists often work together, the differences between them could lead to conflict. They also raised fundamental questions about the meaning of solidarity in the women's movement, divisions in the women's movement, and the question if lesbians were more emancipated than heterosexual women. This chapter looks at some of the cases of how and when lesbian feminists worked in solidarity with heterosexual feminists. In the early 1970s, abortion became a topic for discussion, and the first abortion clinics opened in the Netherlands. Abortion was illegal, but the government had a tolerance policy for pregnancies terminated under 12 weeks in specific clinics. In 1971, the Buiten was founded, which provided safe abortions in the vicinity of Amsterdam. In 1973, they moved to a larger building where they also founded a second abortion clinic, the Bloemenhoven Clinic. This was a sort of sister practice, which performed so-called second trimester abortions between 12 and 18 weeks. The two clinics were kept separate because they expected criticism of the Bloemenhoven Kliniek. If the police came in and shut the clinic down, the Beahuis could keep running. This turned out to be the right move, because in 1976, after a German woman had called in a complaint about the Bloemenhoven Kliniek for reported negligence, the Minister of Justice, Dries van Acht, decided to have the clinic shut down and investigated. On the 18th of May 1976, the management of the Bloemenhoven Kliniek was ordered to shut down the clinic, but they refused. That evening, news of the clinic's imminent closing had reached the Women's House. A group of feminists immediately got in a car and went to the Bloemenhoven Kliniek to try and stop them. 3 of the 4 treatment rooms had already been sealed, but they stopped the officer of justice from sealing the last room. The occupation had now officially started. The occupation lasted 2 weeks, during which the clinic was able to keep running. In the meantime, the issue was being debated in the House of Representatives in The Hague. Van Acht was ready to send in the police to stop the occupation when it was clear that the case was to be taken to court. Until a decision was made, no further steps to close down the clinic would be taken, and it was safe for the time being. In 1981, a new law was to be voted in by the Senate. Abortion remained in the criminal code, but it would not be prosecuted if it took place in a licensed clinic or hospital. Women would not have to give a reason for the abortion, but a mandatory 5-day reflection period was introduced, and women always had to consult a doctor first. A major criticism from the women's movement was that women should have full authority over their own bodies and whether they wanted an abortion, and that it should also be removed from the criminal code. On the 30th of March 1981, a day before the proposed law would be discussed in the Senate, a nationwide women's strike was organized. Women all over the country laid down their paid or unpaid work, and some took to the streets to protest all kinds of sexism, but especially against the proposed law. The law narrowly passed with 1 vote, and in that sense, the women's strike had failed. But the abortion struggle had also led to a unity between feminist organizations through a shared cause. Some of the members of lesbian feminist group Lesbian Nation were among the first to occupy the Bloemenhoven Kliniek. They also joined the women's strike in 1981 in favor of the legalization of abortions. According to feminist Anja Meulebelt, nobody thought it was strange that lesbians were participating in the strike even though they were among the last to need one, because they would partake out of a self-evident solidarity. However, one of the members of Lesbian Nation remembers that debating the night before the strike whether the demonstration was an issue that concerned lesbians, or if it was really only an issue for heterosexual women. The solidarity between heterosexual and lesbian feminists was not always as self-evident as some thought. After the strike, a discussion was held in Serijn, a women's-only bar with a predominantly lesbian clientele and staff, about the place of lesbians in the women's movement. Based on this discussion, an article was published in lesbian zine Bottenblad. It included parts of lesbian pamphlets which were spread during the strike, with some calling it a bottestacking or dike strike. According to the writers of these pamphlets, the struggle for abortion rights was part of the struggle against compulsory heterosexuality, which was theorized by Adrian Rich the year before. They saw patriarchy as a power structure which restricted women's choices over their own bodies. Restrictions on abortion were seen as part of the restriction of bodily autonomy. Compulsory heterosexuality was also seen as restrictions on the body, because it restricted women's agency over their own sexuality. Thus, one of the slogans of these pamphlets was, "Demonstrating for free abortion is demonstrating against compulsory heterosexuality." Although for some lesbian feminists, participating in the strike may have been an act of self-evident solidarity, for other lesbian feminists, this solidarity warranted closer examination. Lesbian feminist pamphlets were spread during the strike, which focused on the role of lesbians in the movement and the importance of lesbian visibility. Rather than simply striking with other women, they felt the need to counteract the silence enforced on lesbians in the name of solidarity. According to one of them, the suppression of lesbian voices in the women's movement in the name of unity and shared feminism led these differences to take on a life of their own, creating oppositions between women that did not need to exist. So they argued for being open about their sexuality, talking about and dealing with the differences between women as the truest form of solidarity. For the women's movement in the US, the 1980s were in a large part characterized by what are now called the feminist sex wars, a series of battles over pornography, BDSM, and sex work. Rather than a think of the children type conservative argument, some feminists linked them to male violence against women. This perspective became known as anti-pornography feminism, although BDSM and sex work were also included in their focus. Although they held a variety of approaches and convictions, they were united in the belief that pornography, BDSM, and sex work were an extension of male violence. On the other side of the conflict, sex-positive feminists questioned whether this was true for all sexual representation. They argued that the anti-pornography stance was based on patriarchal gender roles, placing women in a position of passivity and rendering them incapable of having sexual agency. They also challenged what they perceived as class bias in anti-sex work arguments, which were sometimes expressed as disgust. The central issue was women's agency. Were women necessarily the victims of sex work, or could women sometimes find liberation through sex work as well? Sex-positive feminists acknowledged the exploitative side of sex work, but argued that destigmatization would do more good for sex workers and their working conditions than the restriction of such practices. The feminist sex wars were so deeply divisive that many historians have marked them as the end of second-wave feminism in America. The Dutch women's movement similarly saw a rise of anti-sexual violence and anti-pornography activism during the late 1970s and the 1980s. This also led to discussions similar to those in the US, although it did not lead to the same kind of fatal split. Protests were organized with slogans such as "Porn is the theory, rape is the practice," an adaptation of radical feminist Grace Atkinson's famous quote, "Feminism is the theory, lesbianism is the practice." In the 1970s, groups such as Women Against Rape and the Abominable Snow Woman were founded to organize aid for women who had experienced sexual violence and to protest against sexual violence and the taboo that surrounded it in Dutch society. Another group, called Women Against Porn, saw pornography as the root cause of sexual violence and protested against this during protests against sexual violence and demonstrations against porn. In 1978, the first Heksennacht, or Witches' Night, took place, which were national demonstrations protesting violence against women in the streets at night. Building on the Take Back the Night protests in the US, or the Reclaim the Night protests in the UK, Women Against Sexual Violence organized the first of many such demonstrations, which were held in many of the cities in the Netherlands each year. Walking alone in the city at night was widely seen as incentivizing rape, but feminists argued that they had just as much right to walk in the street alone as men. They emphasized this point by marching through dangerous streets in the cities and claiming their rights to these streets. They emphasized this point by marching through dangerous streets at night. By claiming their rights to these streets, they both claimed their right to the city and their right to bodily autonomy. The struggle against sexual violence, and porn by extension, seems to have brought several parts of the women's movement together. For example, in 1979, demonstrations were organized by groups of anarcha-feminists following the anarcha-feminist weekend in Appelscha. In an edition of the national anarcha-feminist scene, porn cinemas and sex shops were set to raise men to be rapists and to see women as objects to be used at will. The Abominable Snow Woman, an anarchist group against sexual violence, organized a night of graffitiing and plastering flyers onto Amsterdam's sex shops with slogans such as "Women Reclaim the Night" and "This place is full of sexists." In Haarlem, the city was graffitied and plastered throughout the month by anarcha-feminists, including the graffitiing of the town hall with the phrase "Liever lesbisch," loosely meaning "I'd rather be a lesbian." As it happened with the abortion struggle, the struggle against sexual violence was met with discussions in the lesbian feminist community about whether this had anything to do with lesbianism. In an edition of lesbian zine Potteblad from 1982, this issue was discussed by 3 lesbians who were active in the Women Against Sexual Violence group. Responding to a pamphlet that argued that the Women Against Violence movement was organized by and for heterosexual women, they argued that sexual violence was not only a problem which affected lesbians, but that it was also rooted in compulsory heterosexuality. They listed the ways in which women were taught to view themselves as inferior to men, through school, the media, and significantly, through the heterosexual norm, through which women were taught to sacrifice their autonomy and become subservient to men. This in turn led to self-hatred among women, and in this sense they stated that compulsory heterosexuality itself was a form of sexual violence. However, through the women's movement, women were finding new ways to love themselves, to choose women and themselves over men, and to live and work and fight with women, leading them to feel stronger. And yet, they argued, the heterosexual norm and sexual violence were so pervasive in everyday life, through street intimidation, pornography and borderline pornographic advertisements, and through the constant fear of being sexually assaulted. So even though they had found liberation through their lesbian lifestyle, this was constantly impeded by the heterosexual norm. To them, the male-female divide was more pressing than the divide between heterosexual and lesbian feminists, and they concluded by stating, "There are many dykes in our activist group, and, as women against sexual violence, we consider compulsory heterosexuality the foundation of our oppression." In contrast, some lesbian feminists held views similar to the sex-positive feminists in the US. For example, the lesbian magazine Diva espoused sex-positive opinions. Diva had been founded in 1982, in part by women who were members of Lesbian Nation. Diva had been founded in 1982, in part by women who were part of Lesbian Nation, and their views were often in line with that group's views and that of its predecessor, Paris September. However, some of the writers for Diva were enthusiastic about porn when it met lesbian standards, which led to outraged reactions from within the women's movement. Diva did not condemn butch-femme relationships or sadomasochism, which according to many lesbian feminists replicated unequal masculine-feminine relations. When Diva was disbanded in 1986, this was in part due to the difference between their views and the views of the larger women's movement at the time. The discussions about pornography and sexual violence attest to the multifariousness of the women's movement as a whole, and lesbian feminism in particular. Especially pornography and the issues women took with it unified part of the movement, but on the other hand, it was a divisive issue, leading to discussions about which issues were relevant to lesbian feminists and whether some porn and sexual deviance, such as sadomasochism, were acceptable. As shown through the example of the Women's House at the start of this chapter, the feminist movement, and the lesbian feminist movement in particular in the 1970s and 1980s, were characterized by both unifying potential and inherent tensions. The creation of a women's-only space, the struggle for abortion, and the fight against sexual violence and pornography all underscored the need for solidarity and collective action, while at the same time exposing the divides within the women's movement, rooted in different political priorities, theoretical underscorings, and personal identities. Lesbian feminists found themselves at the intersection of these struggles, navigating between their commitment to broader feminist causes and their need to assert their own unique experiences and perspectives. So what does this research reveal that we didn't already know? By stepping away from the dominant narrative of radical lesbian feminism and focusing on the spatial practices of other groups, we've uncovered a much richer and more complex story about the lesbian feminist movement in the Netherlands. Instead of focusing solely on radical statements and theoretical divides, this work has highlighted how lesbian feminists physically claimed space, squatting houses, establishing archives, and taking back the streets. These spaces weren't just locations, they were acts of defiance, manifestations of solidarity, and experiments in alternative ways of living, looking at practices, how these groups collaborated, how they structured their collectives, and how they navigated broader feminist and leftist movements, shifts the focus from abstract ideals to tangible actions. It shows us how solidarity and separatism weren't fixed positions but evolving strategies. And that's where this history resonates with today. Movements now, whether they're fighting for climate justice, racial equity, or LGBTQ+ rights, still wrestle with the same question. How do we create spaces where marginalized voices can thrive? How do we balance the need for safe, exclusive spaces with the need to work across boundaries? As we reflect on this history, one lesson stands out. Solidarity isn't about erasing differences. Lesbian feminists found ways to practice solidarity with homosexual men, heterosexual feminists, and sometimes even with animals, sometimes in spite of their differences, but sometimes because of them. Rather than glossing over differences and enforcing uniformity at the expense of marginalized voices, solidarity should be grounded in mutual respect, open dialogue, and a commitment to the endeavor of creating a better world. The challenges faced by lesbian feminists navigating between solidarity and separatism are not relics of the past. By revisiting these histories, we can better understand how to cultivate spaces that empower individuals while fostering collaboration across differences. Solidarity is not merely a strategy, but a principle, which requires continuous navigation, care, and courage.